The state agricultural inspector, a man whose face was a bland mask of bureaucratic certainty, hammered the quarantine notice into the gatepost. The wood of the Thorne family farm, seasoned by a century of sun and rain, splintered under the force of the blow. Each strike of the hammer echoed across the unnaturally silent fields, a death knell for the vibrant, shimmering green that stretched to the horizon. Dr. Aris Thorne stood motionless, her boots sinking into the damp earth, the rich, living scent of her audacious experiment filling her lungs. Her rice, taller and healthier than any crop the valley had seen in a generation, swayed gently in the breeze, its heavy heads of grain a promise of impossible success. In the flooded paddies below, the dark, ghost-like shapes of koi carp moved like living shadows, their fins stirring the water, their presence the very heart of her miracle. The inspector, a man named Peterson, turned, his eyes refusing to meet hers. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist at the official placard, its bold red letters screaming biohazard and quarantine. The words were a legal cage slammed down over her triumph. He said her farm was an ecological threat, her methods unsound, her crop unsalable. He said it was over. But Aris Thorne, a botanist with grief still raw in her chest and soil permanently lodged under her fingernails, knew this wasn't about ecology. This was about her uncle, Marcus Thorne. This was about the water, the land, and a war she had just, in her moment of victory, lost completely. This is a true story of how one woman, armed with little more than a forgotten agricultural practice and the stubborn ghost of her father, took on a titan and changed not just her own fortune, but the future of an entire valley. It had all begun 3 months earlier, with a phone call that shattered the sterile quiet of her university research lab. Her father, John Thorne, was dead. A heart attack, they said, behind the wheel of his rusting, 20-year-old tractor. He had been found slumped over the steering wheel, the engine still coughing black smoke, the machine itself having finally given up in the middle of a parched, fallow field. Aris arrived back in the California Central Valley under a sky the color of dirty brass, the air thick with dust and the smell of defeat. The Thorne farm wasn't the place she remembered from her childhood. The deep, verdant greens had been replaced by shades of ochre and brown. The soil looked tired, cracked like old leather. The canals that should have been brimming with Sierra Nevada snowmelt were little more than muddy trickles. Her father had been a man carved from the same earth he farmed, weathered and unyielding, but the land, and the system that governed it, had finally broken him. The funeral was a stifling affair, attended by other farmers whose faces wore the same lines of worry as her father's had. They spoke in hushed tones about water allocations, the rising cost of fertilizer, and the impossible margins. They offered condolences that felt more like shared grievances. And then there was Marcus, her uncle, her father's estranged older brother. He arrived in a gleaming black sedan that looked alien and predatory against the dusty farm trucks. Marcus was all polished leather and expensive cologne, his face smooth and unlined, his grip when he took her hand less a comfort and more an assessment. He was the king of this valley, a man who had consolidated dozens of small family farms into a vast, ruthlessly efficient corporate agribusiness. He spoke of her father with a kind of detached pity, the way a wolf might speak of a sheep. The day after the funeral, the full weight of her inheritance came crashing down. She sat in the cold, sterile office of the local bank manager, a man named Henderson whose gaze kept skittering away from hers. The papers were laid out on the desk like a death sentence. The debt was staggering, a monstrous figure that made the air in her lungs feel thin. Her father had taken out loan after loan, mortgaging and remortgaging the land, gambling on rain that never came and prices that always fell. The final, largest loan, the one that had swallowed all the others, had not come from the bank. It had been a private loan arranged by Henderson. The creditor was a holding company, a name Aris didn't recognize. "I don't understand," she said, her voice small. "He kept telling me things were tight, but this is impossible. He could never have paid this back. Henderson cleared his throat, a dry, rustling sound. Your father was an optimist, Eris. A traditionalist. He believed if he just worked harder, things would turn around. He pushed another document across the desk. The primary loan holder is exercising its option. The full amount is due in 90 days, if it's not paid. He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished but absolute. Foreclosure. Who is Agrivest Financial? She asked, pointing a trembling finger at the name on the letterhead. Henderson shifted in his chair. They are a private equity firm specializing in agricultural assets. The lie was so bald, so poorly constructed, it was almost an insult. Eris looked at the man, at his sweaty upper lip and his frantic, trapped eyes, and she knew. She knew who was behind it. She stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the linoleum floor. She didn't need to ask. The answer was already pulling up outside the bank's front window in a cloud of dust, the sun glinting off the chrome of a familiar black sedan. Marcus met her on the sidewalk. He didn't bother with pleasantries. I heard the news, he said, his voice smooth as riverstone. It's a tragedy. Your father was a good man, but a poor businessman. He was drowning. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of feigned sympathy that felt like a brand. I can help you, Eris. I can take this burden off your shoulders. I'll buy the farm, pay off the debt, give you enough to start a new life, back in the city where you belong. He named a number. It was an insult. It was barely enough to cover the principal on the loans, a fraction of what the land, and more importantly, its senior water rights, were actually worth. It was the offer of a predator cornering its prey. Agrivest Financial. It was him. It had always been him, circling, waiting for her father to finally fall. Everything in her screamed. The grief for her father, the humiliation in the bank, the suffocating arrogance of the man standing before her. She looked past him, at the hazy outline of the distant Sierra Nevada mountains, the source of the water he coveted. She looked at his polished shoes, standing on the cracked pavement of a town he was slowly bleeding dry, the city where she belonged. The words echoed in her head, laced with the same dismissive poison her father had complained about for years. Marcus had always seen her education, her life away from the farm, as a betrayal. Now he was using it as a reason to erase her from this place entirely. A cold, hard certainty settled in her chest, displacing the grief. It felt like a stone. It felt like an anchor. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not the grieving daughter, but something else, something he didn't recognize. The Thorn Farm isn't for sale, Marcus, she said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the afternoon heat like shards of ice. His smile tightened, the condescension turning brittle. Don't be a fool, Eris. You're a botanist, not a farmer. You have 90 days. What could you possibly do in 90 days to pay back $500,000? She didn't have an answer, not yet. But as she turned and walked away, leaving him standing on the sidewalk, she felt the first stirrings of an idea. A wild, desperate, impossible idea. It was a memory from a textbook, a footnote in a lecture on ancient agricultural systems. An idea so contrary to every modern farming practice in the valley that it was, she knew, completely insane. And in that moment, insanity felt like the only sane option left. The mockery began, as it often did in small towns, in the corner booth of the local diner. Eris had spent a week locked in her father's dusty office, surrounded by topographical maps, soil composition reports, and her old botany textbooks. She ignored the phone calls from Henderson at the bank. She ignored the smug, "I told you so" text messages from Marcus. She worked, fueled by stale coffee and a growing, furious fire. When she finally emerged, she went looking for the one man her father had trusted completely, Kyle. He was a drifter, a mechanic, a man of few words and immense practical skill who had worked for her father for the last 5 years. She found him at the diner, nursing a coffee, looking like he was about to drift right out of town. She sat down opposite him, the vinyl of the booth cracking in protest. She laid a hand-drawn diagram on the table between the salt shaker and the sugar dispenser. It showed a cross-section of a rice paddy, but it was all wrong. The water was too deep, and there were crude drawings of fish swimming among the rice stalks. "I have a plan to save the farm," she said, her voice low and urgent. Cale looked at the drawing, then at her. His face, a roadmap of sun and wind, was unreadable. "What is this?" "It's an integrated rice-fish system," she explained, the words tumbling out of her, a torrent of scientific theory and desperate hope. "It's an ancient Chinese method. We flood the fields deeper than normal, about a foot. Then we introduce a specific species of carp, koi." He stared at her. "Fish. You want to put fish in the rice fields?" "Yes," she said, leaning forward. "Listen, the koi serve multiple purposes. They eat the weeds that would choke the rice, eliminating the need for herbicides. They eat the larvae of pests, like the rice water weevil, eliminating the need for pesticides. Their waste, their manure, becomes a constant source of natural fertilizer, enriching the soil and feeding the rice. Their movement through the water stirs up the sediment and aerates the roots, which not only helps the plants but drastically reduces the methane emissions that all rice paddies produce. It's a closed-loop, symbiotic system. No chemicals, no expensive fertilizers, just water, rice, and fish." From the corner booth, a laugh erupted. It was sharp and derisive. A couple of farmers, friends of Marcus, had been listening. One of them, a stout man named Bill, swaggered over. "Did I hear you right, little lady?" he drawled, looking down at her diagram with theatrical disbelief. "You're gonna make a fish pond out of your daddy's fields?" Eris felt a hot flush of anger and embarrassment creep up her neck. "It's a scientifically proven method of polyculture." "It's scientifically insane," Bill snorted. His friend joined in. Soon the whole diner was looking, whispering, some of them chuckling. "What's next? You gonna teach him to harvest the rice for you too?" The laughter grew louder. "The fish girl," someone muttered. The nickname stuck instantly. Eris looked at Cale, her plea for help evident in her eyes. He just continued to study the diagram, his expression unchanging. He took a long sip of his coffee. Finally, he looked up, not at the laughing farmers, but at her. "Where do we get the fish?" he asked. The laughter in the diner died down to a confused murmur. Bill stared at Cale. "You're not actually considering this nonsense, are you?" Cale's gaze shifted to Bill, and it was as cold and flat as a winter sky. "She's John Thorne's daughter, and she's my boss." I asked her a question. The authority in his quiet voice was absolute. Bill, flustered, mumbled something and retreated to his booth. Eris let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "There's a breeder near Sacramento. They have a variety of koi that are particularly hardy and suited for this. But it will take everything I have, my savings, everything." "It's your money," Cale said, folding the diagram and sliding it into his shirt pocket. "But this plan, it needs water, a lot of it, and deep. The levees on the back 40 haven't been properly maintained in years. The gates are rusted solid. Can we fix them?" she asked. He gave a slow, considering nod. "Fixing is what I do." That afternoon, Marcus found her at the edge of the property, where she and Cale were wrestling with a seized-up water gate. He pulled up in his luxury truck, the engine a low, arrogant purr. He leaned out the window, a smirk playing on his lips. "I heard about your project," he said, drawing the word out as if it were ridiculous. "A rice paddy aquarium. That's a new one, even for this valley. Your father would be ashamed, Eris." "My father is dead because he tried to play by your rules," she shot back, her hands raw from the rusted iron wheel of the gate. "He's dead because of men like you who hoard the water and rig the prices." Marcus's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. "He's dead because he was a sentimental fool who couldn't adapt, just like you." You have a degree in botany, and this is the best you can come up with? Fish? You'll be the laughingstock of the entire state. Mark my words, in 90 days this farm will be mine, and I'll bulldoze your little science experiment into the ground where it belongs." He spun his tires in the dust and sped away, leaving the threat hanging in the air. Eris looked at the seized gate, at the dry canal beyond it, and at the vast, thirsty fields. She looked at her hands, already blistering. The mockery of the town, the fury of her uncle, the crushing weight of the dead had all pressed in on her. She felt a moment of pure, terrifying despair. What was she doing? This was crazy. Then she looked at Cale, who had picked up a massive wrench and was applying it to a rusted bolt with quiet, methodical force. He hadn't said a word, but his presence was a silent counter-argument to all her doubts. He was here. He was working. He believed, if not in the plan, then in the trying. "Let's get this gate open," she said, her voice hoarse with dust and determination. It was an all-in bet, a gamble with her past and her future, and she had just pushed every last chip she had into the center of the table. The work that followed was a descent into a world of pure physical toil, a relentless battle against decay and time. The farm, long neglected, fought them at every turn. The land itself seemed to have absorbed her father's despair, becoming a stubborn and temperamental beast. The main tractor, the one her father had died in, was a monument to his struggle. Kael, a maestro of mechanics, spent 2 full days coaxing it back to life, his body disappearing into its greasy guts, emerging only for water and to mutter curses at worn-out parts. When it finally coughed and sputtered and roared into a semblance of functionality, the sound was a victory as profound as any academic achievement Eris had ever earned. Together, they worked from before sunrise until long after sunset, their days measured by the slow crawl of the sun across the immense valley sky. They reinforced the levees, their shovels biting into the dry, compacted earth, their backs screaming in protest. The soil was hardpan, baked by years of drought and shallow tilling. It shattered their shovel heads and resisted their efforts with a geological stubbornness. Aris, whose hands were accustomed to the delicate work of a lab, found them transformed into raw, blistered tools. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep, exhaustive pain she had never imagined. Yet, with every shovelful of dirt she moved, with every splinter she pulled from her palm, she felt a strange and powerful connection to the land, a conversation her father must have had with it every day of his life. The water gates were their own special kind of hell. Rusted by decades of neglect, they were fused shut, monuments of iron and inertia. They used chains, pry bars, and the full, groaning power of the ancient tractor. On the 3rd day of the struggle, a critical chain snapped, the metal links whistling past Eris's head with lethal force. She fell back into the mud of the canal bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The nearness of injury, or worse, a cold shock. Kael was there in an instant, his face grim, pulling her to her feet. He didn't say, "I told you so," or "This is too dangerous." He simply inspected the broken link, went back to his truck, and returned with a heavier chain and a new plan. His quiet, unshakable competence was the bedrock on which she built her own resolve. Finally, after a week of brutal, back-breaking labor, the last gate groaned open. Water, precious and life-giving, began to spill into the main canal, a silver ribbon unfurling across the thirsty brown fields. It was a moment of triumph, but it was short-lived. That very night, the first act of sabotage occurred. Aris was woken by Kael's urgent pounding on the farmhouse door. The moon was high, casting a ghostly light over the landscape. "The levee," he said, his voice tight with fury. "The back 40. It's been breached." They raced out in his truck. A 30-foot section of the new levee they had spent days building had been deliberately cut, a clean, sharp slice that could only have been made with heavy machinery. The water, their desperately needed expensive water, was pouring out, gushing back into a drainage ditch, turning their future into a spreading pool of mud. The tracks of a small excavator were clearly visible, leading away from the breach and towards the property line that bordered Marcus's land. Rage, pure and undiluted, choked her. This wasn't a warning. This was an execution. Marcus wasn't just going to let her fail. He was going to actively ensure it. He was trying to bleed her dry, to kill her plan before the first fish ever touched the water. "We can't fix this before morning," she said, the despair in her voice thick enough to taste. "The water will be gone." "Then we don't wait for morning," KL said. He turned the truck's headlights onto the breach, creating a harsh, theatrical stage. "Get the shovels." What followed was a manic, desperate battle against time and gravity. They worked in a frenzy, their movements illuminated by the truck's beams, their shadows dancing like frantic giants. They shoveled mud and earth, their muscles screaming, their lungs burning. They filled sandbags with frantic energy and hauled them into the breach, building a desperate temporary wall. The water, cold and relentless, soaked them to the bone, pulling at their boots, trying to suck their work back into the void. It was a fight fueled by sheer, unadulterated rage. Every shovelful was a curse hurled at Marcus. Every sandbag slammed into place was a defiance of his power. Sometime before dawn, exhausted and covered in mud, they slowed the torrent to a manageable trickle. The breach was plugged, a messy, ugly scar on the land, but it was holding. They had saved most of the water. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and rose, Eris stood, leaning on her shovel, her body a single, throbbing ache. She looked at the patched levee, then at Kale, who stood silhouetted against the rising sun. He was watching the property line, his expression hard as granite. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. "I know," he said, not looking at her. "From now on, I'll sleep in the barn, and I'll be patrolling." He went to his truck and came back, not with a tool, but with his grandfather's old 12-gauge shotgun, which he leaned against the fender. The message was clear. The fight had escalated. 2 days later, the fish arrived. A massive transport truck, emblazoned with Sacramento koi and aquaculture, rumbled up the long driveway, a sight so bizarre in this corner of the valley that farmers in neighboring fields stopped their tractors to stare. Eris had spent every last dollar of her savings on this. 3,000 juvenile koi, a swirling, shimmering mass of gold, white, and black in the truck's massive tanks. With Kale's help, they ran wide-bore pipes from the tanks to the newly flooded fields. The first fish slid into the water, a flash of orange against the brown, then another and another, until a river of living color was pouring into the paddy. The farmers who had stopped to watch now gathered at the fence line, their faces a mixture of disbelief and open scorn. The laughter started again, louder this time, echoing across the fields. "Look at that! She's dumping goldfish in the mud," someone yelled. "Hey, Eris, you gonna charge admission for your aquarium?" Eris ignored them. She stood knee-deep in the water, her heart pounding with a terrifying mix of hope and fear. This was it, the point of no return. She watched as the koi, disoriented at first, began to explore their new home, their dark shapes moving beneath the surface, already beginning to peck at the submerged weeds. It was either the most brilliant decision of her life or the most catastrophic folly. There was no longer any middle ground. The farm was either alive again or it was dead for good. For 2 weeks, the fields were just that, flooded paddies filled with fish. The ridicule was relentless. Every trip to town was an ordeal of whispers and smirks. Marcus drove by daily, a silent, smug spectator to her impending doom. The loan's 90-day clock was ticking. Eris threw herself into the final stage of her plan, sowing the rice seedlings. It was a specialized, heat-tolerant variety she'd sourced at great expense. Another massive gamble. She and Kale worked the seed spreader, wading through the murky, fish-filled water, a process that felt both absurd and profoundly hopeful. Then, one morning, it happened. Eris was making her daily inspection, her boots squelching in the mud at the edge of the first paddy. The sun was just rising, its light catching the surface of the water. And there, piercing the surface, were thousands upon thousands of tiny, vibrant green shoots. The rice had germinated. It was not just growing, it was thriving. The water, which in neighboring farms was already clouding with algae and pests, was astonishingly clear. The constant movement of the koi was working, stirring the water, preventing stagnation. She knelt down, touching one of the delicate green shoots as if it were a holy relic. It was a small thing, a fragile spear of life, but in that moment it felt like a miracle, a quiet, personal triumph that no one else could see or understand. It was the first sign that the land was answering her. The weeks that followed saw the miracle unfold. The rice grew with a speed and vigor that defied all local logic. The stalks were thick, the leaves a deep, glossy green that spoke of abundant nutrients. The system was working just as the ancient texts and modern theories had promised. The koi, growing fat and active, were relentless foragers. They kept the paddies immaculately clean of weeds and insects. There was no sign of the dreaded rice water weevil, which was already forcing neighboring farms to begin their first round of expensive and toxic pesticide spraying. Eris's fields were a self-regulating ecosystem, a vibrant pocket of biodiversity in a sea of monoculture. Then came the external threat, nature's great and terrible curveball. A heat wave of historic proportions descended on the Central Valley. The sky turned a hazy, oppressive white. The sun was not a source of life, but a physical weight, a hammer that beat down on the land. Temperatures soared, day after day, into the triple digits. The air was thick and still. The valley's shallow, flooded rice fields began to suffer. The water, only a few inches deep, heated up like a bath, scalding the delicate root systems. The plants, already stressed by chemicals, began to yellow and wither. Panicked farmers started pumping more water, straining the already depleted canals and their own budgets. This was the great divergence. This was the moment where Eris's madness revealed itself as genius. The foot-deep water in her paddies, which had seemed so wasteful to her neighbors, now became her salvation. The greater volume of water acted as a thermal insulator, keeping the soil and the root systems cool, protecting them from the worst of the searing heat. While the rest of the valley's rice crop was cooking, hers remained a startling, defiant green. The heat wave brought with it a secondary plague, a massive, explosive outbreak of black-tailed stem borers, a pest that thrived in the hot, dry conditions. The caterpillars swarmed the stressed, weakened plants of the conventional farms. From her porch, Eris could see the crop duster planes flying low, trailing clouds of pesticide, a desperate and costly war against an enemy that was already winning. But on her farm, there was an eerie peace. The deeper water and the presence of another ally she had introduced, ducks, created a formidable defense. The ducks, which she herded through the paddies each day, were voracious predators of the snails that hosted the stem borer's life cycle. The koi, in turn, feasted on any larvae that made it into the water. Her farm had become a biological fortress. The spectacle of her success could no longer be ignored. What had been a joke was now a source of stunned wonder. Farmers, who had once laughed from the road, now pulled over and stared in silence. They saw her fields, a lush, emerald carpet stretching to the horizon, an oasis of impossible health surrounded by a landscape of failure. They saw the rice stalks, heavy with grain, standing tall and proud while their own were stunted and yellow. They saw the clear water, the active fish, the placid ducks. They saw a system that was not just surviving, but thriving in the very conditions that were destroying them. The tide of public opinion, that slow and powerful current, began to turn. The whispers of the fish girl were no longer tinged with mockery, but with a grudging, baffled respect. She had done it. Against all odds, she had cultivated a miracle. And now everyone was watching. The success was a beautiful, terrifying thing. Beautiful because it was a vindication of her father's memory, of her own wild faith in a forgotten science. Terrifying because she knew, with a cold certainty, that Marcus would not allow it to stand. He had tried to break her with force and had failed. He had watched nature try to break her and had seen it fail. Now, he would turn to the weapon of the powerful, the rule book. He would not come at her with excavators and shovels, but with inspectors and lawyers. He would use the system itself to crush her. The black sedan appeared at the end of her driveway a week before the harvest was set to begin. It wasn't Marcus this time. It was a state vehicle, official and ominous. The man who got out was Inspector Peterson, the same man from the flash forward, his face a neutral mask that betrayed nothing. He carried a clipboard like a weapon. "Dr. Thorne," he said, the title dripping with a faint, almost imperceptible irony. "We've received a formal complaint regarding non-standard agricultural practices and the introduction of a potentially invasive species on this property." "A complaint from whom?" Eris asked, though she already knew the answer. "The source is anonymous," Peterson replied, his eyes scanning the vibrant, healthy fields with a flicker of something she couldn't quite read. It wasn't admiration. It was something closer to professional appraisal, cold and distant. "My job is simply to investigate the claim. You're using koi carp, correct?" "Cyprinus rubrofuscus." He rattled off the Latin name with practiced ease. "They are not a native species to the Sacramento River watershed. Under State Agricultural Code 48B, Section 7, the introduction of non-native fauna for agricultural purposes without a pre-approved environmental impact study is grounds for immediate quarantine." The words, tangled in bureaucratic jargon, were a garrote tightening around her throat. Environmental impact study? These are domesticated koi. They are contained within a closed system. They pose no threat. "That is not for you or me to determine," Peterson said, his tone flat and final. He pulled the quarantine notice from his briefcase. "Until a full study can be completed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, this entire property is under strict quarantine. No products, and that includes your rice crop, can be harvested, sold, or moved off this land. To do so would be a felony." He walked over to the gatepost, the one her great-grandfather had set 100 years ago, and hammered in the sign. The red letters of biohazard screamed at her. It was a lie, a vicious, calculated lie. Her farm was the healthiest it had been in decades. It was a bastion of ecological balance, and it had just been declared a toxic zone. "How long?" Eris asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How long does a study like that take?" Peterson finally met her eyes, and in their depths she saw a flicker of something: pity, guilt. "These things take time. Interagency coordination, field studies, public comment periods. 6 months, maybe 8. 6 months. The harvest window was 2 weeks. The rice would rot in the fields, and Marcus's loan, the $500,000 guillotine blade, was due in 21 days. This was it. The checkmate. Her science, her hard work, her miracle crop, none of it mattered. He had found a way to let her win the battle, only to ensure she lost the war. She could have the most successful rice farm in California, but if she couldn't sell a single grain, she was bankrupt. Marcus had not just defeated her, he had used her own success as the weapon to do it. The perfect, beautiful crop was now a golden cage, and she was trapped inside it, left to watch her triumph wither and die. Defeat settled over the farm like a physical shroud. The vibrant green of the rice, once a symbol of hope, now seemed to mock her. The koi, swimming lazily in the clear water, were no longer her allies, but the unwitting agents of her ruin. The 90-day clock, which had spurred her to such frantic action, now ticked down with the slow, inexorable dread of a final countdown. Cahill, who had been a stoic tower of strength, grew quiet and grim. He patrolled the property line not with defiance, but with a kind of weary resignation. They had fought the land, the machines, and the saboteurs, but how could they fight a piece of paper? How could they fight a law twisted into a weapon? Eris spent 2 days in a state of numb despair. She would walk to the edge of the fields, the quarantine sign a slash of angry red in her vision, and simply stare. She had poured her soul into this land, resurrected it from the dust, and for nothing. Marcus had won. He would get the land, the water rights, everything. He would bulldoze her beautiful living system and replace it with the same chemical-soaked monoculture that was killing the rest of the valley. The thought was more painful than the financial ruin. It was the desecration of an idea. On the 3rd day, the rage returned. It burned away the fog of despair, leaving a core of cold, hard fury. She would not let him win. Not like this. If she was going to go down, she was going down fighting. She stormed into her father's office, a room she had barely entered since the quarantine, and began to tear it apart. Not in anger, but with a desperate, methodical purpose. She was no longer a farmer or a botanist. She was an investigator, and this farm was her crime scene. "What are you looking for?" Cale asked, standing in the doorway, watching her pull dusty ledgers and file boxes from shelves. "I don't know," she answered, her voice tight. "A loophole, a mistake, anything. This quarantine, it's too perfect, too clean. It's based on a state regulation, but this farm, this land, these water rights, they're old, older than a lot of those regulations. There has to be something here." She spent days buried in paper. She read through her great-grandfather's original deeds from the 1920s, the brittle paper cracking in her hands. She studied the formation documents of the local water district. She cross-referenced agricultural codes with property law, her mind, trained in the rigors of scientific research, now applying that same obsessive focus to the dense, arcane language of the law. Cale kept her supplied with coffee and food, a silent guardian of her frantic search. Late one evening, a plain white envelope appeared, tucked under the windshield wiper of her truck. There was no name, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words typed on it: Piscary, Charter, 1922. Eris stared at the words. Piscary. It was an obscure term, one she vaguely remembered from a legal history class. It had to do with fishing rights, and 1922, that was the year her great-grandfather had bought the core parcel of the farm and secured its primary water rights. She turned back to the mountain of documents on the floor, her heart starting to pound a new, hopeful rhythm. She found the original water charter for the district, and then, cross-referencing it with the deed, she found the clause. It was buried deep in the legalese, a relic of a bygone era. When the water district was formed, the original landowners, including her great-grandfather, had not just been granted rights to the water for irrigation. They had also been granted, in perpetuity, the right of piscary, the ancient common law right to cultivate and harvest fish within the boundaries of their property as an integral part of their agricultural activity. It was a right that predated the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. It predated the specific agricultural code Peterson had cited. It was a foundational right, tied not to the state, but to the land and the water itself. Her integrated rice-fish system wasn't a non-standard modern practice. It was the literal execution of a right that was nearly a century old. The quarantine was illegal. A wild, triumphant laugh escaped her lips. She had it. The loophole. The key. But as she read further, her triumph turned into something else. Something colder and much, much bigger. The anonymous note had not just been a tip. It had been a signpost pointing to a far greater crime. She started pulling the deeds for the surrounding farms, public records she had downloaded in her initial research. She looked at the ones Marcus had acquired over the years, and she saw the pattern. In every single case, when Marcus's corporation, Agrivest bought a farm that had one of these old 1922 charters. The deed was subtly altered. The right of piscary, which was legally tied to the land, was severed. It was transferred, almost invisibly, to a separate shell corporation he controlled. He wasn't just buying land and water rights for irrigation. For decades, he had been systematically stripping these farms of a secondary, forgotten right. He was illegally consolidating the piscary rights of the entire district, hoarding a legal power he had no claim to, creating a secret monopoly within his monopoly. And then she understood the full, breathtaking scope of his panic. Her farm, her little experiment, was a mortal threat, not because it was successful, but because it was legal. By openly and successfully practicing her right of piscary, she was creating a legal precedent. She was showing the entire valley the value of a right they didn't even know they had, a right Marcus had stolen from them. The quarantine wasn't just about stopping her harvest. It was about burying that precedent before anyone else could find it. It was about preventing a single spark of truth from igniting a fire that could burn his entire empire to the ground. This was the smoking gun. It wasn't just a defense against the quarantine. It was a weapon, an atom bomb. She held in her hands the proof that Marcus Thorne, the king of the valley, was not just a ruthless businessman. He was a thief on a grand scale. She knew, with absolute certainty, who had sent the note. It was Peterson. The inspector. The man who had hammered the nail of the quarantine notice into her gatepost. The guilt she had seen in his eyes was real. He was a man trapped in a system, forced to do the bidding of a tyrant who had likely crushed his own family's farm years ago. He couldn't act directly, but he could leave a clue. He could point her toward the truth and hope she was smart enough to find it. Aris stood up, the papers clutched in her hand. The setting sun streamed through the dusty office window, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. The farm was silent, waiting. The game had changed. This was no longer about defense. This was about attack. She wasn't going to just save her farm. She was going to dismantle a dynasty. The next morning, Aris didn't call a lawyer. She didn't file an injunction. She made a single phone call to the secretary of the Central Valley Water District, requesting to be added to the agenda for the emergency board meeting that afternoon. The reason, she stated, was to present new evidence regarding the quarantine of her property. The secretary, a woman who had known Aris's father for 30 years, agreed, her voice tight with curiosity. The entire valley was buzzing with the story of the fish girl's impossible crop and her sudden brutal shutdown. The meeting was held in a soulless, wood-paneled room at the district headquarters. At the head of the long table sat Marcus Thorne, in his capacity as chairman of the board. He looked confident, almost bored, as if this were a minor administrative nuisance. The other board members, all farmers whose own crops were withering under the heat wave, looked grim and tired. They were here to discuss emergency water allocations, not the follies of Marcus's niece. When Aris was called to speak, a murmur went through the room. She walked to the podium not with the frantic energy of her search, but with a cold, deliberate calm. She carried a single thick file. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, filling the room. "I am here today because my farm, the Thorne Farm, has been placed under a quarantine that will, if it stands, financially ruin me. The state claims my practice of integrated rice and fish farming is a biohazard due to the use of a non-native species." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a condescending smirk on his face. "Aris, this is a board for water allocation, not a place to appeal state health regulations. We have more pressing matters." "On the contrary, Marcus," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "This is entirely a matter for this board. Because my right to do exactly what I am doing is enshrined in the very charter that created this district." She opened the file. She laid a copy of her great-grandfather's 1922 deed on the overhead projector, the image of the old, brittle paper filling the screen behind her. She pointed to the nearly forgotten clause. "The right of piscary," she announced. "A right granted to the founding members of this district. A right tied to the land and its water in perpetuity. A right that predates the state's regulatory authority in this specific matter. My farm is not a biohazard. It is the legal and rightful expression of a foundational charter right. The quarantine is, therefore, null and void." A stunned silence fell over the room. The other farmers leaned forward, squinting at the screen, murmuring to each other. Marcus's smirk had vanished. A flicker of genuine shock, then alarm, crossed his face. He had known about the piscary rights, of course. He had built an empire on stealing them, but he never imagined she would find it. "This is an archaic, irrelevant clause," he started to bluster. But Eris cut him off. "It is neither archaic nor irrelevant," she said, her voice rising with power. "And the most interesting thing is, my farm is not the only one that holds this right." She switched the image on the projector to a map of the water district. Several properties were highlighted in red. The Miller Farm, the Santoro Ranch, the old Chen property. All original charter members. All of them held this same right. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Held, past tense. "Because I also pulled the current deeds for these properties, all of which are now owned by your company, Agrivest Financial." She put up a new slide, a flowchart showing the transfer of deeds. With each acquisition, a second, almost invisible transaction had occurred. The piscary right was severed from the land and funneled into a separate shell corporation, Aqua Resources LLC, a company whose sole director was Marcus Thorne. "You see, gentlemen," Eris said, her voice now ringing with triumphant fury, "my uncle hasn't just been buying land. For 30 years, he has been systematically stripping a legal right from every farm he purchased, illegally consolidating a resource he had no claim to. He's been stealing from you, from your fathers. He's been hoarding not just water, but the very legal framework of this district." The room erupted. The farmers were on their feet, shouting, pointing at Marcus, their faces masks of disbelief and rage. They were looking at their own failing farms, at the decades of struggle, and finally understanding that they had been cheated not just by the market or the weather, but by the man at the head of the table. "The quarantine on my farm," Eris concluded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "was never about fish. It was about panic. It was to prevent me, by sheer accident, from discovering this truth. He had to crush my farm to protect his fraudulent empire." Marcus stood up, his face pale, his composure shattered. He looked at the faces of the men who had once been his allies, his subjects. He saw no support. He saw only accusation and hatred. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was finished. The federal investigators who arrived the next day, tipped off by an anonymous call from a certain state agricultural inspector, were merely a formality. His power base, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled to dust in a single afternoon. The quarantine was lifted the same day. The effect was instantaneous. Eris's farm, now free from its legal prison, became the center of a media firestorm. The story of the fish girl who outsmarted a corrupt titan was irresistible, but it was the crop itself that sealed her victory. The harvest was, by every measure, monumental. The yield per acre was nearly double the valley average. The grain was heavier, higher in protein, and, because it was grown without any chemical inputs, it was certifiably organic. A high-end organic food distributor, captivated by the story and the quality, flew in from San Francisco and offered her an exclusive contract at a price that made her gasp. It was more than double the going rate for conventional rice. A week later, Eris Thorne walked into the Central Valley Bank. She wasn't alone. Behind her walked a dozen other farmers from the district, men who had once mocked her, now her staunchest allies. They were there to open new accounts, to move their business away from the bank that had enabled Marcus's schemes. Eris walked up to Henderson's desk. The bank manager looked pale and shrunken. Without a word, she placed a cashier's check on his desk. It was for the full amount of her father's debt, plus interest. Paid in full. She didn't have to say a thing. The quiet, profound satisfaction of that moment was its own reward. 2 years passed. The Thorn farm was no longer just a farm. It was the heart of a revolution. Eris had used the profits from her massive victory not to expand her own holdings, but to form a cooperative. She shared her methods, her science, and her resources with her neighbors. The integrated rice-fish-duck system, once a subject of ridicule, was now being adopted across the valley. Fields that had been brown and struggling were now lush and green. The canals ran clearer. The birds began to return. The land itself, exhausted and abused for so long, was beginning to heal. The co-op, with its combined strength, broke the stranglehold of the big distributors, securing fair prices for everyone. The community, once teetering on the edge of collapse, was being reborn. Aris stood at the edge of the back 40, the same field where her father's tractor had given out. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow on the rice, now heavy with another record-breaking harvest. Kyle, now her farm manager and her partner, stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her back. Below them, in the water, the dark shapes of the koi moved like liquid gold, their children and grandchildren. A flock of ducks glided serenely across the surface, their quiet quacking the only sound in the evening air. "He would have been proud," Kale said softly. Eris nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She thought of her father, a man who had fought the corners of head-on and been broken by it. She had learned a different lesson. You couldn't fight the system on its own terms. You had to step outside of it to find a different way, an older way. You had to listen not to the bankers and the chemical salesmen, but to the quiet, persistent wisdom of the land itself. The land had been speaking all along. It had just been waiting for someone to finally listen. Her farm was alive again, and with it, the whole valley was breathing a new, clean air. The roots she had returned to had not just saved her, they had anchored a new future for everyone.